What I want to do today is, this is going to come kind of in three phases. Let me ask another question. How many of you here are interested in getting out of the city and finding your place in the country? Okay, well, I sort of expected that. Anybody here not interested in leaving the city? You don't want to leave the city. You can be honest. I won't be too hard on you. I had an interesting experience happen to me a few months back. My brother contacted me and said that he wanted to go back to the town where we grew up and went to elementary school together. He was feeling nostalgic and he wanted to go back and visit the elementary school and see the little house where we used to fight and throw rocks at each other on either side of the wood pile. And I was interested in going too. It just so happens that that was in the town of, maybe I shouldn't call it a town, but the little village of Angwin, California. Anybody here ever been to Angwin? Pacific Union College, okay. Well, a good part of my growing up years were there in Angwin, and my brothers and I would walk to school on a trail. And so as soon as my brother said, I want to go back, something came back to me, which is, to my way of thinking, pretty remarkable. Because what I'm getting at is I want to talk to you about how the country living dream was born for me. And somehow I'd forgotten really where it started, the seed for that dream of a country lifestyle. But when my brother said he wanted to go back, all of a sudden it hit me. There was a trail through the forest that we would walk to school, and there was a spot halfway to school on this trail that kind of meandered along above a little creek in a kind of a dark forest. And I am sure that almost every day on that trail, I would think to myself, someday I'm going to have my own place in the country. Isn't that amazing? That was in elementary school. Why I forgot that, I don't know, especially because it was something that I thought of. I'm sure it seems every single time I walk that trail. I can see it in my mind's eye, the place by the creek with the water running through that creek, and I would think to myself, I want to live in a place like this one day. I want to have my own place in the country. And what's, I suppose, even more remarkable is even though I forgot where that dream was born, I forgot the beginning of the dream, God didn't forget. And the time would come when I would be living in the country. I would have my own place in the country with the forest and the trail. And someone one time was quick to remind me, Dave, it's not your place. And that's true. It's not. But I'm so thankful that God didn't forget. I find it interesting that he planted that dream in my heart so long ago. And somehow over time, it seems like I didn't come up with this label. But I've had opportunities now to bump into people who maybe they saw a DVD or heard a CD or whatever, and they said, oh, you're the country living guy. So somehow I became the country living guy. And I got to tell you, it's been a fantastic, fantastic journey and a change in our life. It's been such a blessing. It has changed our lives completely. I look at the decision to move to the country as being one of the most important decisions in our lives. And it has been a blessing in every way. I'll quickly add that it's been hard. In fact, the last 12 plus years have been, at many times, no doubt, the hardest times in our lives. But I would quickly add they've been the best years. I wouldn't trade this experience for anything. It's been a blessing for our marriage. It's been a blessing for our family, bringing up a little girl in the country. I wish so much that I'd had the experience that she's been able to have. I think about times I looked out the window and my little girl was eating between meals, and I know Ben may touch on this, we shouldn't be eating between meals, but she was out in the blueberry patch eating blueberries, fresh off the blueberry bush. And maybe I should have run out and stopped her and said, don't eat between meals. But I was looking, thinking, man, I wish I could have grown up that way. But I'm so thankful for the blessing that country living has been to us. It has been a blessing even in this economy. You know, I hope that nobody misunderstands me, what I'm going to say right now, but I'll qualify it, so I'll try to save my hide here, but I'll stick my neck out first. We live a millionaire lifestyle, but we're not millionaires. I mean, we live on 10 acres surrounded by some of the most beautiful scenery in this country. Now, if we were to try to buy 10 acres in the city, we'd probably need to be millionaires, right? Now, the reason I said I'm going to save my hide on this one is because Mrs. White said that if we would find, you know, a small, modest home, a little piece of property where we could grow our own food, we would live like kings and queens. Have you ever thought about this, that God wants you to enjoy the millionaire lifestyle? Why? Why? Is it just for us? Well, God does love us, and He has, you know, I like to say this, you and I were wired for a country lifestyle. I had a really interesting phone call because the country living message has become of great interest to the media. Are you aware of that? I have now received 2 phone calls from major television production companies. The last one was Nat Geo. Ever heard of them? They found us online. They found us through Back to Enoch, our website. They wanted to talk to me about coming and doing an interview with us for National Geographic because they're telling me that there is a movement in America of people who want to get out of the city, who want to go back and learn to live off the land, a simpler life. Isn't this interesting? And yet sometimes, I'm going to say this, sometimes it seems to me that there's resistance to this message within our own churches. So this is nothing new, that pretty soon the world is kind of running ahead of us. But I wanted to tell you about this conversation with this lady from National Geographic. She was in New York City, and of course I invited her to come to our home, to come visit. And she said, well, I think I'd be afraid. I'd be spooked out there in the woods. I find this so ironic that a person who lives like in Manhattan would be afraid to be out in the woods. But I mean, I think I kind of understand it. But I said this to her. I said, you know what? I said, after a little while, after a few days, it would resonate with you because we're designed for that kind of life. God wired us. I mean, what did He do with man? As soon as He created man, where did He put him? In a garden. Whether or not you feel like you're wired for it, the fact is you're wired for that. I don't know if she'll take us up on her invitation or not, but I'm just so thankful for that blessing. What I want to do this afternoon is I want to cover this in 3 phases. And the first phase has to do with a framework. I really want us to have the right framework, the setting, to talk about the Out of the Cities message. So we're going to briefly look at an overview, a sequence of end-time events. It's not a time chart. It's a look at end-time events. And I'm interested in looking at what I believe are the highlights. You know, we could drill down very deep and get into great detail. And some of you, I'm sure, you know, would enjoy doing that. We're not going to take the time to do that today. We're going to look at some highlights because there's a framework and there are some underlying principles that I think it's very valuable for us to talk about. Then in the next session, we're going to look at this question of the Out of the Cities message specifically. Is it biblical? Does the Bible actually teach that there would come a time at the end when God's people should get out of the city? I think it's an important question. Then we're going to focus in on that and ask ourselves what unique perspective and understanding do Seventh-day Adventists bring to the table in terms of the country living message. And then in the third session, this afternoon, evening, whatever time it is by the time we get there, we'll try and not be like, Paul who went till midnight. But you don't have any high windows here, I don't think. So maybe we can go a little later. No, we'll try to rein it in. But the third time together, what I'd like to talk about is city evangelism and the country living message. Because I think it's important to understand this in the context of city evangelism. And it just so happens that city evangelism is often the issue which seems to neutralize the call to the country. Because people say, well, we've got to reach the people in the cities, and that's true. So I feel like each of these three topics is extremely important. I hope that you can stay with us so that we can have at least what I'll feel comfortable with as a kind of a well-rounded look at this topic. Okay, so let's see. This is a new, I think I just follow the arrows, huh? All right. So let's begin with a look at an end-time event sequence. And this really started for me. The seed for this presentation came 4 years ago as we were approaching the last presidential election. And the reason that I say that is because you might remember as we had a lot going on in 2008 in the fall, remember? Even big banks, big names like Morgan Stanley were predicting a major event financially in the fall of 2008. It didn't take a prophet to know this. Just simply people pushing pencils and looking at the numbers could see that we were headed toward this nightmare, financial nightmare. And so as early as June of 2008, Morgan Stanley came out with a warning about something that would happen in the fall of 2008. As that buzz was cranking up, and of course we're approaching a presidential election at that time, the emails were flying. I don't know if you guys get all the emails I get. And there are emails, I'm sure, that aren't just limited to Adventist circles, but some of the emails that fly around in the Adventist circles are something else. And there were all kinds of predictions that, well, if there's a financial collapse in the fall, then the Sunday law would have to be passed before that. Did anybody see that email? I got that email. I make a note of these emails. Then there were the emails that said that there was going to be a major event, some kind of disaster, and that martial law would be declared, and there would be no election, so that Bush would stay in. Did anybody get that email? I'm not trying to make fun of anyone on this, okay? I want to be careful how I present this, because, you know, I mean, that's not entirely implausible, right? But it just seemed to me that people who were Seventh-day Adventists were just kind of like blowing around, almost like a ping pong ball bouncing off the walls with the latest email that came in from somebody who had inside information. This came from somebody in the military. This one came from somebody with security clearance, and they know what's going to happen. And those things didn't happen. Now, of course, there was a pretty big financial disaster, but there was an election. Did anybody get emails like that over the last few months? I did. I got the one again about martial law is going to be declared, there won't be an election. Why am I bringing all this up? Well, you know, for one thing, it kind of bothers me that when people send out predictive emails. Now look, we're going to talk about prophecy. I believe in predictions, but I really want to rest on predictions that are solid. Okay? And there's all kinds of other stuff out there that is not so solid, that gets speculative. And when we send this stuff around, I want to suggest to you it hurts our credibility. I still remember as a teenager when a guy came to our town. I grew up in the church. You know, maybe it's unfortunate. I don't remember a lot of things that I heard in church when I was like 14. But I remember this. This guy had friends on the inside sources. The economy is going to collapse in 6 months. It's interesting to me. That's when I was 14, like years ago. And I remember that, and it didn't happen. Well, I want to suggest to you it hurts our credibility, sometimes even in our own walls, with our own young people. When we jump on little bandwagons, little predictions, and we shoot these emails around, one of the things that's bothered me is I've never gotten an apology email after it didn't happen. But I've gotten another email about the next thing that's going to happen from the same people. My point is this. It really had me concerned in 2008. And I thought, there must be a better way. I mean, after all, we're called people of the book, right? So we're people who have a more sure word of prophecy, right? We have also a more sure word of prophecy, 2 Peter 1:19. And I felt like I want to go back and I want to just lay out a sequence, a sweeping sequence of end-time events that would help me so that when I get these emails, because I don't believe in just having your head in the sand either, but when somebody comes along and they say this or that or whatever's going to happen next, I can kind of plug it into that. And I can ask myself, does it fit? Does that make sense to you? Does it fit? And so that's why I put this presentation together. And so that's what we're going to do. So here we are in 2012. And let's just jump right in. Now, there's a lot of places we could start, but let's start now, all right, since that's where we are. So it's a little bit off the screen there. Let's see. 2012, and let's drop into this, this line. It's not a timeline because I don't have any dates for you today, okay? Let's drop in some events. How many of you are familiar with the National Sunday Law, the concept of such a thing? Okay, most of the hands went up. Okay, so we're going to put that there. We're going to put the final close of probation, and then, of course, we're going to put the second coming. Now, what I'm interested in is what's going to happen between now and the second coming. What are the highlights? What are the big points along the way that could be helpful for us as we look at events, as people start to send us more of those emails or whatever? We got to plug them in to help us to understand. And by the way, there's something interesting that's going to come out of this study as it relates to the country living message. So starting now, between now and the Sunday Law, in the book Great Controversy on page 582, it says this: "The last great conflict between truth and error is but the final struggle of the long-standing controversy concerning the law of God. Upon this battle we are now entering." Now that comes from a chapter called The Impending Conflict. And so that's what I'm going to label this time period between right now and the National Sunday Law. And now let's drill down a little bit. Let's see if we can understand better what we should expect to happen that's going to take us from here to the National Sunday Law. Because I think that's something that's been misunderstood. I think there's been a fair amount of confusion about that as well. Let's see what we can find in inspiration. And we'll start by turning to Revelation 18:10, where it says, "Standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come." Now here's something, this is a big takeaway that I hope that you'll get from this. That one of the things I'm finding as I'm looking at Bible prophecy in the context of what's happening now in the world around us is that the focal point is honing in on cities, on metropolitan areas. Now I could cite a number of examples for this. I won't spend a lot of time there, but militaries more and more are having to focus on fighting in what they call the urban environment. There is more and more focus. In fact, we posted a very interesting video from the United States Air Force on Back to Enoch, and now I'm trying to remember if that connection is still easily accessible. It was 2 or 3 years ago I posted this. It was an official video showing development on something called MAVs. Have you heard of MAVs? That stands for Micro Air Vehicle. Now, when I describe this, you might be thinking, this sounds like science fiction. It's not science fiction. It's real. And it's an ongoing technology. They're trying to develop very small flying robots that look like birds and now even insects. And birds that can even carry a payload. And in this video from the Air Force, they show, it's all a digital representation, but you get the concept. When you see this thing that looks like a real bird flies up and lands on a power line, and the voice narrating the video explains that they will be able to recharge their battery by landing on power lines. And they have cameras that hone in and can spy. Soon they show a swarm of little micro air vehicles that look like bats going inside of a building. And pretty soon the voice explains, the narrator explains that they'll be able to carry payloads, and then you then watch a digital representation of this little bat-like robot firing a bullet or whatever at a person and killing them. What interested me most about this video, you can even find this on YouTube. Just type in MAV. This is, and understand, look for the official one from the U.S. Air Force, okay? Just to understand that we're not talking about fringy stuff here. In fact, if you search MAVs, you'll find that the technology, they're really working intensely on this. But here's the point of me telling you the story, is that the narrator for the U.S. Air Force video explains that this is going to become one of the key components for battle in the urban environment. There's a huge focus to the metropolitan areas, and I want to suggest to you that, you see, we should have seen that coming, because the Bible also focuses our attention on the city. Now somebody's thinking, hey, Dave, look, that's symbolic, that's spiritual, Babylon. True. But I want you to understand there's also a literal connection. When the Bible focuses on Babylon, there's a literal connection that should jog our minds, should tell us that there's going to be an importance, that the conflict is more and more going to be seen happening in the metropolitan setting. So let me show you something, just so you know that I didn't invent this connection. I didn't invent the idea that when the Bible talks about Babylon in Revelation 18, that we should understand a literal connection. Yes, a symbolic, a spiritual connection. I'm not taking away from that, but a literal connection. I didn't invent that idea. Here it is from the pen of Ellen White. Really interesting. Manuscript Releases, Volume 21, page 91. Let all who would understand the meaning of these things read the 11th chapter of Revelation. Now let's pause right there. What's in chapter 11? Okay, somebody says the French Revolution, that's what it's talking about, but like specifically, where does this activity take place that's being described in Revelation 11? Anybody remember? Okay, but what does Revelation 11 tell us? Where is it? Great city, and it names two cities. One of them we don't think of as a city, right? It says Sodom and Egypt. Remember that? Revelation 11. So I just wanted to remind you what she's talking about here. She says, read the 11th chapter of Revelation. Now notice, read every verse and learn the things that are yet to take place in the... Do you see? Now, Revelation 11 is a symbolic representation about the French Revolution, but you see how she's making a literal connection? Look at this as she keeps going. Read also the scenes portrayed in the 18th chapter of the same book. What's in Revelation 18? We just read it. Babylon is falling. So you see what she's telling us? Yes, there's a spiritual connection. There's a symbolic meaning, but don't miss the literal meaning too. That when Revelation 18 says that the smoke is ascending up and people are standing from afar wailing, expect to really see that. Is that a stretch? If you've seen the news clips from 9/11, then you already saw that, right? I mean, there were literally people standing afar off, smoke's ascending, and they're wailing. Now, I'm not suggesting that's like, you know, the fulfillment. I think we're going to see more of that. Okay, so the point being this, in this time, the impending conflict between now and the Sunday law, expect to see an increasing focal point on metropolitan areas. Now, notice this, from the Great Controversy, page 589. He, talking about Satan, will bring disease and disaster. Oh, how interesting. Where's it focused? Until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. Now look, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not suggesting that if you live in the country, you're immune from disasters. In these natural disasters, there are people in rural areas that are hit as well. But ask me where I'd rather be. Would I rather be on Staten Island or, you know, in an outlying area? It's clear to me where I'd rather be. But notice this. Satan brings disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. So, expect to see an increase in disaster and disease focused on metropolitan areas. This, by the way, is key because this, we're going to see in a minute, this is what drives the National Sunday Law. And I think there's been some real confusion about this and a misunderstanding. Some people have felt like the economy or the financial problems will drive the Sunday Law. Well, that's a component. And if you have major disasters, physical disasters, there is undoubtedly a financial component, right? When we just think about the fact that what happened in 2008 in the fall was related to, really, in layman's terms for me, that I can kind of get my little head around it, it was an insurance company debacle. Insuring investments. What happens when insurance companies that insure buildings and they all of a sudden are hit with a long, long list of buildings that are wiped out, that are destroyed? There's going to be a financial component, but we need to understand that it's disaster and disease that drives this thing. Now here's something else that comes, and this is, if you don't get anything else out of this presentation, this is probably the most important thing that I want to say here about the relationship of end-time events and an understanding of end-time events to the country living message. And that is this. Throughout history, God has established a pattern. Before judgments come, before disasters come, what does he do? He warns his people. Why does he warn them? You know, he loves them and to help them to get out of the way, right? I mean, look, you know, there's a part of me that would like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah to end differently. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if it's just like there's nothing there except now smoke and embers, and out come Lot and his family? Wouldn't that be cool? But that's not what happened. That's not how God did. And by the way, Sodom is an example for us, right? So that wasn't the plan. Yet I hear people saying today that, you know, I'm gonna die in the city serving the Lord. Well, you know, half of me resonates with that because I think how noble. But I mean, really, how noble is it to try to go out in glory while being disobedient? I mean, how do we do that? Right? Hey, no, thank you, Lord. I'm not going to follow your plan, but I hope you notice what I'm going to do. It's going to be really good. Doesn't work in my head. So, we could go on, right? We could go on. We could talk about Jerusalem. What was the plan? What was God's plan? Warn them. They get out before it comes. What did we just read about Babylon? Those plagues are coming. Come out of her, my people. Interesting, isn't it? So, here, this is the punchline. How many of you heard, either growing up or whatever in the church, that it's the Sunday law that will be the signal to leave the cities? How many of you heard that? Well, let's just think about this for a minute, because that's what I heard for a long time too. But if it's disaster and disease that wipe out cities, that drives the Sunday law, then that means that God's going to have to totally change his modus operandi here. That instead of doing what he's always done before and say, get out of the way, he's going to say, no, stay there, stay in the mess, and then come out after the Sunday laws are passed because of the mess. It doesn't make sense, does it? It doesn't fit the pattern. Now, somebody's probably thinking, well, but don't we get that idea from something that Mrs. White said? And yes, I believe we get the idea from a misunderstanding of something she said. And we're going to look at that in a few minutes. So I just want to establish this idea that there's increasing disaster and disease in the cities that drives the Sunday law. Now, let me read some statements on this point about that being the driver for the Sunday law. Storm and tempest, war and bloodshed. Hey, let's pause right there. What kind of disasters are these? You have two categories, natural and man-made. Interesting, huh? In these things he delights, and thus he gathers in his harvest, and so completely will men be deceived by him that they will declare that these calamities are the result of the desecration of the first day of the week. Ah, do you see it? That's what drives it. We'll keep reading. From the pulpits of the popular churches will be heard the statement that the world is being punished because Sunday is not honored as it should be. And it will require no great stretch of imagination for men to believe this. They are guided by the enemy, and therefore they reach conclusions which are entirely false. From Review and Herald, September 17, 1901. Now, one thing that's interesting to me about this statement is that for this to happen, there's going to have to be a shift in thinking. Right? We're not there yet. Why do I say that? Because when 9/11 happened, remember the preacher who had to apologize because he suggested that maybe that was a judgment? Who was that? Falwell. I think it was Jerry Falwell. Had to apologize. And he was pressured to apologize, by the way, by his preacher peers. But we're talking about a time when preachers will not be afraid to say, we're being punished. It's going to be so bad. That's going to be the conclusion. We're being punished. What are we doing wrong? It must be this issue of Sunday observance. Now, there's another reason why it requires no stretch of the imagination, and that's because it says here, whoops, there we go. They are guided by the enemy, and therefore they reach conclusions which are entirely false. A couple more statements. Men in responsible positions will not only ignore and despise the Sabbath themselves, but from the sacred desk will urge upon the people the observance of the first day of the week, pleading tradition and custom in behalf of this man-made institution. They will point to calamities on land and sea, to the storms of wind, the floods, the earthquakes, the destruction by fire, as judgments, indicating God's displeasure because Sunday is not sacredly observed. You see, we've looked at a number of different statements now. You see the case is really being made that it's disaster, disease, it's these calamities that drive the Sunday law issue. And notice this one from Last Day Events, page 129. Satan puts his interpretation upon events, and they think, as he would have them, that the calamities which fill the land are a result of Sunday breaking. Thinking to appease the wrath of God, these influential men make laws enforcing Sunday observance. All right. So the question of the enforcement of Sunday observance becomes agitated as a result or in a response to the disaster and the disease and the calamities that are happening in the land. All right, let's move ahead. In Revelation 18:1 it says this, after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. In The Great Controversy, Mrs. White wrote this, page 606, it has been confidently declared that this land could never become other than what it has been, the defender of religious freedom. But as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, the event so long doubted and disbelieved is seen to be approaching, and the third message will produce an effect which it could not have had before. Why could it have not had that effect before? For one thing, the timing wasn't quite there. You needed to have this thing unfolding before your eyes to believe it. There are people now who read it and they don't believe it. They say, no, that's not going to happen. So now you can also make an argument that it will have an effect like never before also because of the power of the Holy Spirit. But we can't underestimate the importance of the timing and the events, which are inarguable, that in fact it is happening. Okay, so this is really talking about the third message, swelling to the loud cry. There's a pattern that I want you to just start looking for a pattern here. There's an interesting pattern as I started to lay this chart out that to me seemed really significant. Let's go a little bit further and see if you can catch this pattern. Last Day Events, page 201. As the third message swells to a loud cry and as great power and glory attend the closing work, the faithful people of God will partake of that glory. It is the latter rain, which revives and strengthens them to pass through the time of trouble. So we're talking about the latter rain. And of course, this comes from Joel chapter 2, verse 23. Be glad then, ye children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, and he will cause to come down for you the rain, the former rain and the latter rain in the first month. Even in this latter rain, there is this pattern that I'm alluding to can be seen. Notice this. By the way, this is interesting to me because I've heard people say, what's the latter rain for? They pose this question. Is it to give power to the loud cry, to the message? Or is it to prepare God's people? You know that people argue over that? And to me, that's a pointless argument because we're told that it's for both. Right here in Early Writings, page 86. At that time, the latter rain, or refreshing from the presence of the Lord, will come to give power to the loud voice of the third angel and prepare the saints to stand in the period when the 7 last plagues shall be poured out. So let's go back to our chart. We'll put the latter rain there. And there's one more thing I want to put before I ask you the quiz question. What's the pattern? Okay. This comes from Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, page 332. This was written in 1900. We are in the shaking time. Oh, have you seen that one before? We are in the shaking time. Is the shaking time only in the past, though? Did it something that happened? No. Notice this. Evangelism, page 360. In the absence of the persecution, there have drifted into our ranks men who appear sound and their Christianity unquestionable, but who, if persecution should arise, would go out from us. Notice this one. Last Day Events 173 and 174. The time is not far distant when the test will come to every soul. The mark of the beast will be urged upon us. Those who have step by step yielded to worldly demands and conformed to worldly customs will not find it a hard matter to yield to the powers that be, rather than subject themselves to derision, insult, threatened imprisonment, and death. The contest is between the commandments of God and the commandments of men. In this time, the gold will be separated from the dross in the church. Is that a reference to the shaking also? But that's future, right? So what does that tell us? Well, we were in the shaking time clear back in 1900, so it's kind of off the chart here on the left. But it keeps going. Now, do you see the pattern? What's the pattern? Exactly. Increasing intensity. Everything is a development. It is not just a single point in time. To me, this was huge to start to understand this idea, because there's certain things I heard about as an Adventist, and I just thought that's a point in time. It's just an event. One day it could be in the news. Hey, it happened. But it's a development. It's a process that starts small and increases over time. We see it with the disaster and disease. We see it as the Sunday law question is starting to be agitated, and it goes from the people talking about it, the pastors talking about it, the legislators talking about it. We see it with the third angel's message swelling to the loud cry. We see it in the latter rain. The latter rain even has been taught to us by God himself as the early rain and then the latter rain. And then we see it in the shaking, this increase in intensity. And what's interesting to me is that pattern now will continue as we go through in some interesting ways. So let's move on. And I want to read this quote because there was a statement that Mrs. White made in the book Early Writings, and there were people that got confused about it, and there was a lot of discussion like, what did you mean by this? And so in a subsequent edition of Early Writings, she explained the statement. So this is kind of interesting. Something that was confusing, or people became confused for whatever reason, she goes ahead and she clarifies it in a later edition of the book. So this is on page 85, 86, I think, in Early Writings, and she's talking about something that appears on page 33. And the issue was this, that she had said, well, let's read it. Here's the quote that she's going to explain from page 33. I saw that the Holy Sabbath is and will be the separating wall between the true Israel of God and unbelievers, and that the Sabbath is the great question to unite the hearts of God's dear waiting saints. I saw that God had children who do not see and keep the Sabbath. They have not rejected the light upon it. And at the commencement of the time of trouble, we were filled with the Holy Ghost as we went forth and proclaimed the Sabbath more fully. That's the quote now she's going to explain. Well, why was there confusion about that? Because people said, hey, wait a minute, the time of trouble, but the time of trouble is after the close of probation. And who needs to go preach about the Sabbath at that point? Nobody's going to change their mind. So they're raising a question. So Mrs. White says, oh, okay, let me explain. So are you with me? So she's going to give the explanation now to this apparent dilemma. This view was given in 1847 when there were but very few of the Advent brethren observing the Sabbath. And of these, but few supposed that its observance was of sufficient importance to draw a line between the people of God and unbelievers. Now the fulfillment of that view is beginning to be seen. Now here she goes. She's going to explain the time of trouble that she talked about on page 33. The commencement of that time of trouble here mentioned does not refer to the time when the plagues shall begin to be poured out, but to a short period just before they are poured out while Christ is in the sanctuary. The meaning of that little phrase there, while Christ is in the sanctuary, in other words, probation hasn't closed yet. People still make decisions. So there is a little time of trouble, and if you wondered where that ever came from in Adventism, Mrs. White, I haven't found that precise usage of that phrase, but this is the concept, that there is a time of trouble that she called the time of trouble before the big time of trouble. And now, that shouldn't disturb us because we've already seen this pattern, right? That things start small and they grow in intensity. So why wouldn't we expect the time of trouble is going to be the same way? It starts kind of small, still bad, and it increases in intensity. So, oh, by the way, here's the rest of that quote. At that time, while the work of salvation is closing, trouble will be coming on the earth, and the nations will be angry, yet held in check so as not to prevent the work of the third angel. So, I'm going to put this label over this next segment, the little time of trouble. Okay? Now, let's take a closer look at the Sunday law issue. Another thing that I know myself for so long in my life, I just saw it as a point in time. Sort of this event that's going to happen one day. But you know where we're going now. It's a process. So let's take a look. This is from Revelation 13. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Revelation 13, 16 through 17. In the Great Controversy on page 607, Mrs. White wrote this. As the movement for Sunday enforcement becomes more bold and decided, the law will be invoked against commandment keepers. They will be threatened with fines and imprisonment, and some will be offered positions of influence and other rewards and advantages as inducements to renounce their faith. Now here we're seeing this picture painted of a process. Because notice where it goes. In the Desire of Ages, pages 121 and 122, in the last great conflict of the controversy with Satan, those who are loyal to God will see every earthly support cut off. Because they refuse to break his law in obedience to earthly powers, they will be forbidden to buy or sell. It will finally be decreed that they shall be put to death. There it is again. It's a process. Starts mild, increases in intensity. But notice this. It increases in intensity, and it increases in another way as well. Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, page 18. As America, the land of religious liberty, shall unite with the papacy, enforcing the conscience and compelling men to honor the false Sabbath, the people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example. Now here's another kind of increase. What is it? This is a geographical increase, an increase in scope and breadth. Another statement, Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, 395. Foreign nations will follow the example of the United States. Though she leads out, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? People are suggesting, hey, is it starting somewhere else? Is it starting in Europe? Now, my purpose here is just to show you, what I found in inspiration. Though she leads out, talking about the United States, yet the same crisis will come upon our people in all parts of the world. So here we have increasing Sunday legislation. Starts mild, inducements, fines, imprisonment. It keeps increasing in intensity, no buying or selling. ultimately a death decree. And it increases in scope until it becomes international. Now, I always put this picture here so that I won't forget to say something. That's one of our garden pictures. And before you, I heard someone say something admiring back there. Look, I'll have to make a confession, okay? It's only fair because we had a gardening seminar at our house. And so we had a bunch of help. Hey, look, it's a great way to plant your garden. Hold a gardening seminar. Bring in a master gardener. You know what? I had people fighting to plant stuff in that garden. I couldn't even get my hands on the seeds. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because, let me go back. This period of time here, little time of trouble, this is when you're going to get the maximum leverage from country property, from a country lifestyle. Why do I say that? Well, because we're in this time of no buying and selling. Remember that quote that Ben read? We'll look at it again here in a minute. In fact, let's see, maybe we can look at it right now. Adventist Tome, page 141. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions, for in the future the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. Now, if that's not talking about the little time of trouble, if that's not talking about the Sunday law development, then I don't know what it's talking about. We should now begin to heed the instruction given us over and over again. Get out of the cities into rural districts where the houses are not crowded closely together and where you will be free from the interference of enemies. You know, this is such an important concept to me. The country living message, as much as anything, is about God wanting to position his people so that they can be as useful as possible when the crisis is at its peak. You with me? I want to suggest to you, it has everything to do with us being useful instruments, useful agents to help a suffering world. And people say to me, well, look, how realistic is that? So everybody in the city comes out because they know you've got food. What are you going to do? Interesting conversation that I had with a neighbor where we live out in the country. I think that he considers himself a Christian. We were sitting at the table one day talking. He dropped by for a visit, and somehow this subject came up. Interesting, you know, I don't think he regularly attends church anywhere, but I know he considers himself to be a Christian. But he's already thinking about what's going to happen when stuff comes down in the cities and the people start coming up to our neck of the woods. He brought it up. And the topic of what are you going to do when they get to your house came up. And you know what he told me? He said, I'm going to shoot him. See, there's a dirt road that goes into where we live, and there's a few other people that live there in the woods. And he said, hey, we're going to get the neighbors together. We're going to set up our own posse. We're going to be parked out there at the head of this road, and nobody's coming in. And I said, what if they did get in? What if there's more of them than there are of you? What if you're outgunned? And they get to your house, what you going to do? He said, oh, I'd still shoot him. So I tried this on him. Honestly, I don't know that I convinced him, okay? So how's that for a prelude? I'll try it on you. But I think I'll have an easier job convincing you. Look, if they come to me, I mean, that's the whole point, right? I mean, isn't this like our dream? They're coming to me. Hey, look, I not only have food, I got answers. Well, come on in and we'll cook something up for you. Maybe they'll be more urgent. Maybe they'll want to take our stuff. Hey, what am I going to do? Give it to them. And here's my rationale. If there's ever a time that God could multiply the loaves and the fishes, don't you think that might be one of those cases? In fact, look, this is not a stretch. I didn't just make that idea up. I don't know how it was one day it just hit me. It just hit me in the face as I was reading the story about Jesus multiplying the loaves and the fishes. And this is so interesting. How did he do it? How did he do it? He could have created it out of thin air, could he not? But what did he do? He turned to the one person who showed up prepared. Isn't that interesting? One person who had food in a crisis. He said, hey, come here. And that's when he worked that miracle. And I told my neighbor that. I said, that's when I'm counting on a miracle. And by the way, if somebody comes in a crisis and you've got food, and they thought they took it all, and they come back and there's more, and they ransack the place, and they come back again and there's more, they might be very open to some other information. Right? See, I really believe this is all about positioning. God wants us to be positioned. Yeah, it's good for you too. It's good for me too. But it's not just about us. And I have to tell you, look, I feel bad. I honestly do. I saw something on the news the other night of these people in Staten Island having a protest because power was down. I feel bad for them. Don't take what I'm saying here wrong. But what I heard coming out of that lady's mouth is, we want the power on now. Let me tell you, when you live in the country, you don't have that mindset. That's a frame of mind. And I'm sorry for them. I'm not trying to make fun of them. That's where they live. That's what they're immersed in that. But when you start living in the country, living off the land, it's interesting, Mrs. White says that the greatest, noblest men of the Bible were reared in a country setting, and part of it is they learned how to deal with difficulties. They learned how to make stuff work and make stuff happen. They didn't sit there and say, come fix it now. Right? Okay, we better keep moving here. If any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. Matthew 24, 23 to 26. So this is the personation of Christ by Satan, right? Now, Mrs. White has some interesting things to say about this. As the crowning act in the great drama of deception, Satan himself will personate Christ. The church has long professed to look to the Savior's advent as the consummation of her hopes. Now, the great deceiver will make it appear that Christ has come. In different parts of the earth, Satan will manifest himself among men as a majestic being of dazzling brightness, resembling the description of the Son of God given by John in the Revelation in chapter 1, verses 13 to 15. The glory that surrounds him is unsurpassed by anything that mortal eyes have yet beheld. The shout of triumph rings out upon the air. Christ has come! Christ has come! The people prostrate themselves in adoration before him, while he lifts up his hands and pronounces a blessing upon them, as Christ blessed his disciples when he was upon the earth. His voice is soft and subdued, yet full of melody. In gentle, compassionate tones, he presents some of the same gracious heavenly truths which the Savior uttered. He heals the diseases of the people. And then, in his assumed character of Christ, he claims to have changed the Sabbath to Sunday and commands all to hallow the day which he has blessed. He declares that those who persist in keeping holy the seventh day are blaspheming his name by refusing to listen to his angels sent to them with light and truth. This is the strong, almost overmastering delusion from page 624. Great controversy. Now, I put this here, Satan's personation of Christ. And I realize some people believe that it goes over around the sixth plague. But the only thing that doesn't make sense to me about that is this is called an overmastering delusion. And what's the point of deceiving anyone after probation has closed? Plus, did you notice how part of the deception is that, hey, look, I've changed the Sabbath. It all fits into this time period of the little time of trouble, of Sunday legislation, the focus on false worship. All right. Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 80. The Lord has shown me clearly that the image of the beast will be formed before probation closes, for it is to be the great test for the people of God, by which their eternal destiny will be decided. Now, there's more in this passage. If you read it, I believe the context is very clear that this is talking about when she says that the image of the beast will be formed, she's speaking synonymously of the Sunday law development. And I realize there are some people out there that think differently about that. But to me, I can't get around it. If you just read it in context, it seems very clear. And now there's a concept here that we want to touch on just for a moment. 1 Peter 4:17 says, the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel? The same concept appears in Ezekiel 9, where it talks about starting at first at the house of God, or starting in the sanctuary, rather, with judgments. And the concept is this. God holds his people accountable to a higher standard. Is that unfair? No. Because we have more light. And if you make a profession on that light, then you should be held to a higher standard. And the idea is this, that that's where the judgment then starts. Because you have less excuse than others. So here is how this looks in my way of thinking, and I put here the close of probation for SDAs. That really kind of brings it home. What I'm trying to get at is the concept that so far the pattern we've seen is that things are a process, right? And I want to suggest to you the close of probation is the same way. That it begins with people who have greater light. It begins with people who have made a profession. Now here's, I don't think it's a problem, but some people seem to get tripped up on this. Is that they say, well, how long do I get? Like, if this is the final test, then how long do I get? And they're uncomfortable with the concept of it being sort of a process because of that. I'm not worried about that. God knows how long you need, right? One thing I do reject, and I don't mind saying it here, I know some Seventh-day Adventists believe that when the National Sunday Law is passed, that means that probation's already closed. That doesn't make sense to me. Because how is it a test unless you can respond to the test? Now, I know it's kind of simplistic, but when I was in school, well, in the classroom, always in school, right? Are you? Okay. So when I was in the classroom, when the test was passed out, it didn't already have a grade on it, did it? That would really be unfair. I had to take the test. How long does it take? I don't know. For me, I was the kind of guy that would take the whole time. Even if I filled out all the answers, I was going over and looking at everything, and sometimes I'd even analyze myself into the wrong answer. Right? Did you ever do that? On a multiple choice or something? Is it that one or that one? No. And then you had it right, and then you change it. Okay, that was me. But then there was another guy in class, and it seemed like there was more than one of them. Like 20 minutes before class is out, they walk out, they hand the test, turn the test in. And usually they aced the test. It might be an exception, somebody just like totally blanked out or they didn't prepare and they got an F. So why do we have to be so worried about how long it takes to respond? I don't know how long it'll take you, how long it'll take me. The point is there's a test and we respond to that test. Let's move on. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Daniel 12:1. Here's how Mrs. White described it. When he leaves the sanctuary, darkness covers the inhabitants of the earth. In that fearful time the righteous must live in the sight of a holy God without an intercessor. The restraint which has been upon the wicked is removed, and Satan has entire control of the finally impenitent. God's long-suffering has ended. The world has rejected his mercy, despised his love, and trampled upon his law. The wicked have passed the boundary of their probation. The Spirit of God, persistently resisted, has been at last withdrawn. Unsheltered by divine grace, they have no protection from the wicked one. Satan will then plunge the inhabitants of the earth into one great final trouble. And as the angels of God cease to hold in check the fierce winds of human passion, all the elements of strife will be let loose. The whole world will be involved in ruin more terrible than that which came upon Jerusalem of old. page 614. So, this is the great time of trouble. It's getting kind of hot up here. Revelation 15:1, and I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels, having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. Early Writings 36, I saw that the 4 angels would hold the 4 winds until Jesus' work was done in the sanctuary, and then will come the 7 last plagues. So the 7 last plagues follow the close of probation. Notice this one, Great Controversy 6:27 and 8. When Christ ceases his intercession in the sanctuary, the unmingled wrath threatened against those who worship the beast in his image and receive his mark will be poured out. The plagues upon Egypt when God was about to deliver Israel were similar in character to those more terrible and extensive judgments which are to fall upon the world just before the final deliverance of God's people. So, here are the 7 last plagues. Now, there's something interesting about the 7 last plagues. I think it's interesting. We'll go ahead here and I'll show you. Revelation 13:15 says this, he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So here we have the death decree. On pages 36 and 37, it says this, of Early Writings, I saw that the 4 angels would hold the 4 winds until Jesus' work was done in the sanctuary, and then will come the 7 last plagues. These plagues enraged the wicked against the righteous. They thought that we had brought the judgments of God upon them, and that if they could rid the earth of us, the plagues would then be stayed. A decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. So the death decree is a response to what? The plagues, okay? And notice it's plagues plural, okay? Now, in Great Controversy, says the Revelator, in describing those terrific scourges, there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. Which plague is that? That's the first plague. The sea became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. Which plague is that? Okay. The rivers and fountains of waters became blood. Which plague is that? That's the third. Okay, why am I asking you? Well, watch this. Terrible as these inflictions are, God's justice stands fully vindicated. Now, she goes on to quote from Revelation 16 right after the third plague has been introduced. The angel of God declares, Thou art righteous, O Lord, because thou hast judged thus, for they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. Very interesting. Now notice what Mrs. White said about this. By condemning the people of God to death, that's a death decree, they have as truly incurred the guilt of their blood as if it had been shed by their hands. Did you catch something here? That the death decree, in God's eyes, is the same as if they'd gone ahead and killed them. But the point is this. We know that the death decree comes in response to the plagues, plural, so you've got to have at least 2. And by the third plague, this comment is made by the angel, which tells us that the death decree must have come. So I'm suggesting that the death decree, it's my understanding, must come right about there, between plagues 2 and 3, or in that area, because by the third plague, that statement is made. Okay? Reading on. A decree will finally be issued against those who hallow the Sabbath of the 4th commandment, denouncing them as deserving of the severest punishment and giving the people liberty after a certain time to put them to death. Romanism in the Old World and apostate Protestantism in the New will pursue a similar course toward those who honor all the divine precepts. The people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. Thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. All faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Jeremiah 30:5-7. And reading here from Great Controversy 6:15 and 6:16. So that death decree as I understand it, becomes the spark, kind of the start of the time of Jacob's trouble. Now this is interesting. Mrs. White wrote this. As Satan accuses the people of God on account of their sins, the Lord permits him to try them to the uttermost. Their confidence in God, their faith and firmness will be severely tested. As they review the past, their hopes sink, for in their whole lives they can see little good. They are fully conscious of their weakness and unworthiness. Satan endeavors to terrify them with the thought that their cases are hopeless, that the stain of their defilement will never be washed away. Boy, it sounds fearful, doesn't it? He hopes so to destroy their faith that they will yield to his temptations and turn from their allegiance to God. Though God's people will be surrounded by enemies who are bent upon their destruction, yet the anguish which they suffer is not a dread of persecution for the truth's sake. They fear that every sin has not been repented of, and that through some fault in themselves they will fail to realize the fulfillment of the Savior's promise. I will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world. Revelation 3:10. If they could have the assurance of pardon, they would not shrink from torture and death. But should they prove unworthy and lose their lives because of their own defects of character, then God's holy name would be reproached. Do you see what it is that puts them in such anguish? They don't want to misrepresent God. Here's a question to ponder. Don't answer out loud. Are we there? Are you there? Am I there? Where I'm more concerned about maybe letting God down than I am about what the outcome might be to my physical person. Well, this takes us up to the very end. Deliverance comes, doesn't it? Huh? Now look, this would be a real bummer if we couldn't go there, right? Because this whole chart is like this increasing bad, right? I mean, this would be depressing. But there's a good ending. I love this description. It is at midnight that God manifests his power for the deliverance of his people. The sun appears, shining in its strength. Signs and wonders follow in quick succession. The wicked look with terror and amazement upon the scene, while the righteous behold with solemn joy the tokens of their deliverance. Everything in nature seems turned out of its course. The streams cease to flow. Dark, heavy clouds come up and clash against each other. In the midst of the angry heavens is one clear space of indescribable glory, whence comes the voice of God like the sound of many waters, saying, "It is done." From Revelation 16:17. You know, I don't like to comment on pictures in my presentation because it's not a slideshow. But this is my favorite picture of the Second Coming. There's been a lot of great paintings of the Second Coming, but the reason this is my favorite one is because, you know, I got to be careful how I say this. I mean, no criticism to any wonderful artist who's tried to depict the glory of this scene. But you know the pictures that, like, mom and dad are in their Sabbath best, and the angel is bringing the little baby, maybe who died, and she's all ready for cradle roll, you know, in a little dress, little pink dress. It's like, I don't think so. I like this picture a lot better. I mean, those people are like, they're ragged. Really, you know, face it, they've been through the ringer, right? I want to be in that group. Don't you? I want to be one of those people that's looking up saying, "Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him and he will save us." It's going to be a great day. We got to get there, folks. What do you say?